watching this evening from virtual land. Very pleased to have you. My name's Rob DeSpirito, and it continues to be my pleasure and privilege to be your city manager. I'd like to introduce some of the folks that will be helping to present and assist this evening. David Eubanks, who's our deputy city manager. Susan Chung, who's our finance director, and Ron Kowali, who is our budget manager. We also have present with us the senior leadership team. I wanted my department heads to be here. I think it's very important that we all get an opportunity to listen to you all, as this is a budget forum. I'm not sure, it's probably been a little while since the city's had this format, but really I give credit to all of you and the suggestions that have come to me that we have more of an opportunity for a true dialogue about the budget. Not just, and we'll still have all of those traditional opportunities once we get into the formal budget development process next spring, where there will be public hearings, there'll be opportunities to speak prior to a council meeting, including ones where there's work sessions and reconciliations. And you can always communicate with your members of the mayor and council, of course, in person and through emails and coming to the meetings as well. But I thought it was very important, and I think you all thought it was important, to have an early conversation, to have that opportunity to express some of your ideas, some of your questions, some of your thoughts in a venue where we can have some true dialogue about it. Back in September, we did a very similar format for housing, and we discussed housing tax credits and other housing matters. We went for 90 minutes, and I think we had an outstanding discussion. I'd like to have a similar invitation to all of you to work with us at our invitation to speak freely about issues past, present, and future with respect to the budget, primarily future. But we're going to have a brief presentation where we have an opportunity to lay out some basic information. I promise you it will not be death by PowerPoint. We're trying to keep it somewhat limited, and we have a lot of graphics. We would like to show you some things that will illustrate our financial position as a city and help paint the picture of what we're going to be dealing with, in our opinion, this coming fiscal year. For those of you that don't know, I believe most of you do, but our fiscal year begins on July 1st, ends on June 30th. The mayor and council have a process whereby they begin with their goals and priorities. We'll have a new council beginning fairly soon. There's a survey that we'll be doing with the new mayor and council. Also, then that will culminate in just very shortly after that, still yet this fall, an opportunity for the mayor and council to discuss publicly what their goals and priorities are. There'll be opportunities for public input on that. There'll also be many opportunities as we get into the spring. I would deliver my budget proposal by the end of February, early March. Ultimately, mayor and council have work sessions, public hearings, budget reconciliation, do a lot of listening to all of you, and then ultimately try to bring it together in a final budget vote by the first week in May and get the tax rate set. I would like to also emphasize that we have a number of surveys. There's an online survey presently available to you. I think it was about mid-October that we posted it online. It is open until December 2nd. And then we're going to do it again once the budget has been brought forward publicly. After I deliver my proposed budget in early March, and the mayor and council begin to receive presentations from the departments, and then ultimately have their work sessions and begin discussing it. During that time frame, once you see what's actually proposed, I want to provide this second opportunity for members of the public to comment in the form of electronic survey. We also have sent this out paper form, which can be filled out with a pen or pen or pencil, and if that's folks' preference, if you don't have electronic devices, and we understand and respect that, hard copy of the current budget proposal, current budget survey, survey has just gone out with the most recent edition of the newsletter. So that's available to folks. We also have copies here at the community center available upon request. I'm also reaching out to my employees as well, and I don't mean just the folks that normally put the budget together. I'm providing opportunities for the employees all the way to the front ranks at any level of the organization to take a little bit of time at work to meet in small groups and or just individually submit, whether their names are on it or not, their budget ideas, particularly on efficiencies. The emphasis is about ways that we can save money in our operations, innovative ideas for operating, and also for revenue. If there's if there are various fees and so forth that we feel that we are not covering some of our costs, or we're way behind other communities, it at least might be something worth looking at. Ultimately, certainly hope to try to avoid an increase in the property tax rate. Your mayor and council did not increase it this past year, and I always head into a budget season like this with the idea that we're going to try to avoid that each year and see if we can first focus on being as efficient as we can be and resourceful and find other ways to get it done. We are very sensitive to the fact that increases in the property tax rate, particularly for single-family homeowners, make it increasingly difficult to afford to stay in their own home. We have seniors on fixed incomes. We have folks that, as the valuations, which is not done by us, that's done by the county, but as the valuations increase, even without a tax increase, it costs more dollars for you as a homeowner. We don't want to contribute to that to the extent that we can possibly avoid it by increasing that tax rate. So we're going to try and have that as a goal. We have not received our revenue forecasts yet. There are information that we don't receive, frankly, until even the early next year, after January 1st. I also have not seen the expenditure proposals from or revenue proposals from the departments. But early on, we want to try and establish that as a mindset. And one of the reasons that we wanted to gather all of you tonight is to help us think of ways that we can be more economical, try to stretch the tax dollars as far as we can, try to avoid a tax increase, and also try to deliver the best possible services that we can to this community. We are facing some major challenges, and we're going to touch on this a little bit in the presentation once it's up. But financially, we have a number of dynamics at play. One is that, of course, inflation marches on. There are things that we must purchase in order to provide services to the community, and whether they're contracts that we have, insurance, health insurance, we have fuel. There's all kinds of things that we have to acquire in order to operate. Materials, supplies, and all of that is subject to inflation beyond our control. So there is, unfortunately, always an upward pressure in expenses. We also have a situation where the ARPA money that the community received a few years back, it was approximately $17 million. The U.S. Treasury Department has some very firm deadlines for all communities, all jurisdictions, cities, counties that receive these funds. They must all have been committed to be spent by the end of this calendar year, and they must all be slated to be spent by the end of calendar year 2026. The vast majority of jurisdictions have used this as revenue replacement and direct assistance to its residents. And I do really, not even having been here, I commend this community the mayors and councils that have devoted a big chunk of what that ARPA money was to some direct assistance to folks that were hurting during the course of the COVID emergency pandemic. Unfortunately, all good things must come to an end, and that federal money, which was a one-time shot, is to the point where next fiscal year we're not going to have very much left to work with. Some of it is committed and will show up in the budgets. Some of it in capital projects, and some of it in very valued programs to assist our residents. But there's not much of a shelf life left for the ARPA money. This is something we've seen coming. We tried, the theme for this year's budget that the Mayor and Council approved, the FY25 budget, was a bridge forward. And we knew we had to begin to bridge between an ARPA world where we had a little bit more to work with and a financial picture where we don't have that to work with, and try to incorporate what we could into the general fund, try to find other resourceful ways to continue some of these programs through work on partnerships with other organizations, nonprofits, caregivers. And a lot of work has been done in that area by both the mayor and council and staff. We will continue to do that to try to extend as much value as possible on the ARPA dollars that are left. But there is a true transition. Some have called it the ARPA cliff. Literally, when the money's gone, we're back to relying on revenue sources that we have traditionally had. We have labor contracts. With FY26, this next budget, we will be into our third year of commitment to the two labor unions that we have, AFSCME and Local 400, which is primarily police. We have obligations there, and we will honor those. We also have some decline in a few other revenue sources as well. One of these that is actually a good news, bad news thing is the speed camera fund, where we had been receiving initially, when the program was stood up, a fair amount of revenue. Then as compliance occurred, the revenues have dropped. Well, in compliance with safety, i.e. lower, less incidents of speeding, there's been less incidents. So that means that it's safer, but we have less revenue. These programs like this weren't designed to be a revenue source. They're primarily for safety. But we also have to realize that we were paying for a number of things, including the program itself, with revenues that we received. We have stood up a red light camera program, but it's unproven in that we are just now rolling it out. And we don't have any track record yet of what amount, literally in terms of revenue, that will generate, but we will have knowledge of that in a year, and we have to be a little bit cautious on what we project we could spend within those revenues. So at this point, do we have the ability to put the, oh, okay. Okay, that's fine. So in looking at another dynamic that is challenging for us as a community compared to a good number of other communities is that our tax base is a little bit unusual. We don't have industrial parks, we don't have an office park, and we don't have a very large commercial district, all of which can bring pretty significant revenues to a community, and thus relief on individual single-family properties in terms of the need for how much tax revenue would be necessitated. So over time, I would say that half of our community is in single-family homes. Approximately half of the residents are in multifamily structures that are, in many cases, tax subsidized, owned by nonprofit organizations, subject to tax abatement, and so forth, and don't generate the same degree of revenue to the local government that might be the case in another community it has less of that type of housing. Now, we're blessed to have this type of housing because it provides just absolutely crucial valued housing at an affordable level as possible for many, many residents, thousands of residents in this community. And that's something that Tacoma Park can continue to be proud of. From a financial standpoint, it does present some challenges. One of the things that we need to ultimately look at down the line is what can we do rather than continuing to look to the property tax is can we begin to expand the community's tax base and do it strategically, do it in a manner where we can get the best value and have the least impact. I think a lot of that might be development along New Hampshire and University, maybe in conjunction with proximity to the Purple Line. We've got major thoroughfares there and a lot of property, commercial property that is relatively underused and that strip retail with large parking lots. Could some of that be redeveloped into much higher value properties that would house more people, including an increment for affordable housing, and bring in, because of the value of that new development, bring in tax revenue that would help support the very important programs that the city offers and services, and not put the undue pressure continuously on single-family properties. So that is a long-range strategy. That's, again, something we're going to need to talk about over time and together. But it is, in the short term, continues to be one of our challenges because we do receive relatively less revenue than other communities from commercial, industrial, and other types of revenue sources. That being said, we do think that we can find a way forward, particularly working with all of you. I think there's opportunities that we can be not just more efficient, but try to find some creative partnerships and creative ways with respect to revenue that will help us have the continuity of services that we'd like to have in the community. And I'm just going to talk just a moment longer because the purpose of this isn't so much for me to talk as for me to listen to you. But a few other key things. I'm just going to, we were going to have it on a screen, but I'll tell you a few key dates a little bit in mind. And we'll have this on our website as well for the budget process. In December, the mayor and council will set, the new mayor and council will set annual budget goals and priorities. January through March, myself and my senior team build the budget, and mid-February, we receive the constant yield rate from the county. In March, early March, I present the draft budget to the mayor and council and the public. Also in March, the departments begin to make their presentations to the mayor and council and the public over a series of meetings. In April, we conduct public hearings, work sessions, and budget reconciliations. And ultimately in May, the council would adopt the budget and set the tax rates. When we get the presentation going, I'll be able to show you some things visually, just in terms of representing a profile of our budget. But I guess I'll just conclude my initial remarks here with the challenge. Nobody will leave empty-handed, I promise you. There you go. There you go. Yeah. Yeah. Now, one of the challenges financially for the organization is that for about the last 15 years, we've had to operate with what amounts to a structural deficit. This is in essence where we don't have enough revenue source from the revenue from the sources that we normally would want to draw from variety of sources, and have to go into reserves, in other words, to balance the budget. This has been really the case since 2014. Um, there were several years, I think in 2013, we did not have a deficit situation, but the 2 years prior to that we did. So, by what? Yes. By had to, I mean that by state law, we're required as a municipality to balance the budget. The mayor and council are obliged to adopt a budget that is in balance. How we balance that is ultimately up to the mayor and council, and ideally, you don't have to go into your reserve funds in order to do that. This past year, we went into the unencumbered reserves to the tune of about $1.4 million. The city in some years has gone in as deep as $8 or $9 million in the past 10 years. There were a couple of instances of that. Usually it's much less than that. But ideally we want to get into a situation where we aren't having to rely on reserves, because you can't always rely on reserves. It's not a sustainable approach. There are going to be years when our reserves are going to fluctuate. And one reason that we have reserves, there's two reasons. One is that the mayor and council has a very prudent policy in place of having 17% of unencumbered funds, basically funds that have not been allocated for something, to be held specifically and protected in reserves for emergency purposes, should the city need them. That's one reason why there's a reserve base. But really what's been tapped is not within that policy amount, it's what's been above that policy amount. So in addition to 17% held back in reserves prudently, we've also had a balance each year such that we've had adequate funds to balance the budget. And this past year, again, about $1.4 million had to be tapped out of reserves above the 17% policy in order to have the budget legally balanced. So that is what I meant by the cities do have to balance a budget, but they are allowed to use reserves. It's not a best practice. It's not a sustainable practice, and it's not a practice that we wish to continue forever. I think what we have to do is, over a series of years, build our way financially out of that, and that's part of the conversation. That's going to be part of what, over a number of years, we try to do in a variety of ways. Okay. And I'm sorry? Okay. All right. Well, since anybody who has not received a copy, please raise your hand. Okay. Everybody's got one. So I've just touched on the budget process. If you would turn to the next page, please. This is a budget combined revenues by fund. And I'm glad you have these in hard copy, because we wanted you to be able to have something that you could take back with you and examine a little bit more on your own time, and circle back with questions or comments if you have them. A lot of this is information that is generated from our current budget document, which is also online. But the purpose of this pie chart here is to illustrate, you can see clearly that the general fund represents 77% of the revenues that we get. And that's comprised of property tax, commercial tax, cable franchise tax, railroad and utility tax, and some other things. Okay. The next largest fund that we had, source of revenue that we have, is the ARPA funds. Okay, and that would, in the current budget, that would represent 10% of our budget. It will be smaller next year. Next is special revenue funds. That's primarily grants, a variety of grants that the city gets, some of which are true grants and some of which are matching grants. And speed and red light camera fund. Between those, we're in the current budget, we're estimating 5% of our revenues will derive from those sources. And finally, stormwater management fund. There's stormwater fees that help propel our projects and services in stormwater. So that's what this illustrates. The next page is where we try to show expenditures by fund. I can speak to tax duplication. Absolutely. The city, in a number of categories, receives some monies from the county as a reflection that we provide services that they do not need to. We get money for police, crossing guards. We get some what was it, the road, public works, and recreation. I don't have the list in front of me. Yeah. But it's primarily, the biggest by far is tax duplication, tax dupe money for the police department. Those are funds that we, as a city, along with our sister cities, jointly petition the county to work on a formula that represents the most amount of reimbursement that we can get. It's kind of a negotiation. It's been in place for a number of years. We're getting a little more, as are most other jurisdictions, than we all have in the past. And I think it represents, Chief, correct me if I'm wrong, it's about 50% of your, I think $5 million out of your $10 million budget approximately, right? Okay. Just to illustrate. But we're actually very fortunate to have tax duplication here. I've not even encountered it in other states. This is actually a pretty progressive thing for the counties to do. Most other counties, you're on your own. But we do continue, and the mayor and council have it as a priority to continue to advocate for a larger share of reimbursement, including some other categories that, like recreation and I think monies for land acquisition, for parks and open space, that we believe we ought to have some recognition for and some support for. Okay. Sure. Mm-hmm. Okay. It's the fund balance. It's the fund balance. Susan, you can explain it technically, but it's the fund balance.
We do have the fund balance in the general fund, and the fund balance in the general fund contain different type of reserves. Can be
Your mic's not.
It's not on.
Is there a button?
Is it working?
Yeah, now it is.
So in the general fund, we do have several type of reserves. The most important reserves we have is called the unassigned reserve. The unassigned reserve is the reserve money, which is actually the accumulation of the revenues the city receive over the years, and we put it in this called unassigned reserve. And in 2018 or fiscal year 18, the council had established a reserve policy, and the reserve policy was actually following the guideline from the GFOA. It's the General Financial Office Association, GFOA, and they recommended that the smaller cities, bigger cities, counties, they do need to maintain a reserve that's sufficient for the operating costs for at least 2 months. And the equivalent of that 2 months is about 17% of the city's total revenue. So we established that policy, and since then we have been keeping at least 17% of our revenue money in that reserve, and it's called unassigned reserve. And we do have other reserves. The most familiar with a lot of the citizen is called equipment replacement reserve. We do have a facility maintenance reserve, an emergency reserve, and also around the same year we established the reserve policy. We do have a housing reserve established. So there are all reserve funds that is being kept in our general fund under the capital or equity classification. Okay, so we have been keeping all these reserve for many years. Unfortunately, the reserve contribution to all these separate reserve is coming from the unassigned reserve, meaning that anytime when we need to transfer money to contribute to the equipment replacement reserve, we need to take the money out from the unassigned reserve in order to replenish the reserve balance. Did I answer the question? They are accounted for in our revenue, in our general fund revenue section. And there are 4 categories. Okay.
Go ahead.
So the city manager just mentioned the 4 categories, and the total of them is around about over $5 million. Okay.
Can we use the microphone, please?
The reason I asked the question is that there's no reference to the reserve or where the money comes from or how it's drawn down to cover the deficits in these documents that you passed out. There's nothing it's not mentioned anywhere, so it's not clear how we are paying for this deficit every year. The deficits in some cases year by year are more than 20% of the city's revenues. So more than the 17% we're supposedly setting aside. So I'm just saying it's just really cryptic. I'm not questioning that it's there. It's just not explained in these documents at all.
Well, thank you for the question. And this wasn't meant to be a complete description of the entire budget. A lot of this we cover, but it's a fair question. Okay, and it comes from the general fund unassigned reserve.
I have an answer for you. I need to find that particular page, so you can look at that particular page to show how much that we're using for the reserve. And that page on the FY25 adopted budget is page number 46. Page number 46 on our adopted fiscal year 25 budget. And that page is called General Fund Balance Projection Detail. And it's telling you what is the current year fund balance, okay, at the end of the current year. And then we project based on the expenditure and different types of contribution, what would be the fund balance at the end of fiscal year 25. So because this is the 25 budget, that's why we project for fiscal year 25. And at the end of the year, based on this page, our estimated fund balance was supposed to be $12.6 million in the fund balance. That includes all the reserve that I just talked about, the unassigned reserve, the equipment replacement reserve, the facility maintenance reserve, the emergency reserve, and all those reserves are included. And then the estimated balance is going to be $12.6 million at the end of fiscal year 25, sorry.
Thank you for the wonderful explanation. For people that aren't accountants, you would think that a year over year budget deficit would be devastating to a family. So, and there's so many different words and reserves and all of these things. It sounds like we have a tremendous reserve, yet this chart shows, and we were crying about this for the last 10 years, that we kept saying the city's spending more than it's taking in. So has this, if I summed up this column, is this been taken from the reserves? I mean,
One point of this current budget, $1.4 million has come from the unassigned reserves.
but
in
every
order to
single
balance
year
the
it's a
budget.
deficit. So it
Yes.
had to come from
Well,
somewhere.
and this is one of the reasons why we chose to really highlight that at
Thank
this
you.
meeting, because we're trying to be transparent. We understand we got a big hill to climb financially, structurally with this.
Wait. When you
with this
say
community.
transparent, you said that you had to run a deficit. You were was the
Well, we
city,
didn't raise the tax
wait,
rate.
can I ask you a question? Was the city legally obligated to every year run this deficit?
City was only obligated to balance the budget each year.
So this is a
You can
balance.
do it with,
This
you
is a-
can do it legally with reserve funds. It's not a best practice.
So was the
But
city
it's- you can do
legally
it.
obligated to have this budget deficit every single year?
We're not obligated to have a deficit. We're obligated to balance the budget.
And this is the idea of a balanced budget by taking from reserves?
That's not, the reason that I'm highlighting it today is that.
I know, I'm not
we're
blaming you.
in-
I'm just trying to
I understand, but
it.
you can
There's-
see where it's been less in the last 4
So-
years. We're trying to get to a point where we're no longer needing
I
to use
hear
reserves.
that word reserves, a lot of reserves. There's a tremendous amount of reserves, and I heard we had to run this deficit every single year. That's what I heard. It was,
In order to balance the budget, that was necessary to do.
and this is the city's idea of a balanced budget.
May I
it's-
explain
No,
something?
no, no. I don't
Right,
want an
right.
explanation.
Yeah, yeah. Yes,
You-
yes,
So,
okay.
You have your question, right? Okay, awesome. Let's answer the question.
Yeah.
And then we see a hand over there. We will work the room. Okay. Go ahead.
Okay, this chart is actually quite deceiving because because what happened is when the city started to finance our library construction, we actually issue a bond. We issue a bond, and that bond money was around $7 million at that time. So the bond money that we receive is technically saved for the purpose of construction of the library facility, and this money is put into something we call bond reserve. And of all the reserve that I just mentioned, I did not include the bond reserve, and the bond reserve that we had has been paying for the library construction. And when you look at the number on page number 10, those deficit numbers starting from fiscal year 18, you can see that the deficit amount increased tremendously. And that is because when we estimate to build the library, we were estimating to have the library constructed within a few years. So, for example, when you look at the page, look at fiscal year 18, you can see that the total deficit was $7.9 million. And bulk of that money is because of the capital expenditure, which include the library expenditure, okay? The library expenditure could be 6 million or something like that. And we had the money in our reserve to pay for that $6 million. So it is technically not a deficit because the money is being saved and reserved in our bond reserve. So we have the money. It's just because the expenditure amount is much higher than the revenue. It seems like that we are running a deficit. Okay? Thank you.
Yes, please.
Chantal Warzala, I live on Maple Avenue, Ward 1. First of all, thank you for your comments. I really appreciate the emphasis on efficiency. We haven't met yet, but I have actually read the City of Tacoma Park budget a few times and looked at it. And I actually have a structural question about all of these separate reserves. And as a taxpayer, I actually have a pretty strong concern that having all these separate reserves, each with its own amount, is inflating expectations on the money available to spend. Because the habit has been to say, well, we must have X amount in this reserve and X amount in that reserve without doing a zero-based budget to say, what do we actually need on streets and highways. We're just saying, oh, let's increase what we've had in that reserve by 5% or whatever, year after year after year. So I have a real concern about the structure and the use of these class by class reserves, because I think I don't mean to be rude, but I think it makes budgeting lazy. And it gives an appearance that that money must be spent. And that, I think those two things together are problematic.
Yeah, I understand your points. I appreciate your comments very much. Reserve funds are normally set up because there's a policy decision made that we're going to spend money for a discrete purpose, okay? Whether it was equipment reserve, facility reserve, and it's a way to keep the accounting straight. And also, for instance, if we're going for grants and matching grants, and you've got a place that those monies that come in don't just get lost in the wash of the general fund, but that monies that are supposed to be dedicated for a discrete purpose per the policy, that's a way, really an accounting measure as much as anything. And I'm not sure I've ever seen a city that didn't have separate reserve funds for the reasons that I just mentioned. I appreciate the point that you're making, and I understand it can be viewed that way. And so it's not perfect because it's subject to interpretation differently, but from an accounting standpoint, and Susan, I know as a CPA and our finance director, you've managed funds and dedicated reserve funds. You're welcome to add to my explanation of that.
The reserve funds was set up. It was actually, we had it with the agreement with the council, because especially with the equipment replacement reserve, we understand that this is special reserve. It was created and it was recommended by one of the council because of all the yearly expenditure that we need to make for the equipment replacement. And I mean, my assistant here, Ron, he can explain how the equipment reserve should work for us. And it is a very important reserve that we need to keep in order that we can project to how much money that we are going to spend. Especially these are the most important equipment. For example, the police vehicles, the trailers, and all those equipments. It's very expensive. So if we just use our current money to pay for maybe a 500,000, the trash truck, it will be pretty much depleting our regular reserve. But instead, we contribute year after year to our equipment replacement. So it will smooth out our regular reserve money. So it won't be like that we have to spend a whole chunk of money during 1 year because we have to buy a huge equipment. So there is a purpose of setting up these reserves. And each reserve has a special purpose and is mainly recommended and is approved by the council.
Just to make sure you understand, it wasn't the existence of the reserves, but the way we just always fund them at the same amount every year or increase the funding for them. So it was more about the budgeting decision.
Yeah,
as
there are
opposed
certainly
to
years we
the
haven't
actual.
put the same amount of money in. And there are differences between the funds. Certainly, as going through the pandemic, most jurisdictions weren't able to put the kind of money into reserves because they were just they had so much revenue loss that a lot of what they were spending was in the other categories. Well, it depends on what you're going to use. A lot of that went to capital and very dedicated services to residents. But a lot of the reserve funds for things like equipment stuff didn't necessarily get that same measure of, say, ARPA money. Yes, there's a question here.
Hello, my name's Natalie Hopkins. Sorry, I have hoarse throat. I'm from Ward 1, Piney Branch Road, and I was just wondering about the money that we received back from Montgomery County. Is that part of the general fund? Is that accounted for in that line item?
Yes, it is. it is received by the city, and we have a general fund revenue that kept all these what we call the in lieu of payment from the Montgomery County, and it is kept in our general fund revenue.
The general fund is it? Do you know?
The revenue total for fiscal year 25 for the general fund is
It's only in certain categories that the county
is
concedes to do that. It's about half of our police budget.
so the total general fund revenue that we estimated at the beginning of fiscal year 25 is about 30 million. And the in lieu of the payment from the Montgomery County is about $5 million. Okay, so
And we're going to try and get more. Yes, sir.
David Reed, Ward 2. I'm also president of Long Branch Sligo Community Association. I'm speaking on their behalf tonight. Though we haven't had a broader meeting about the budget, I want to thank you very much, Rob, for doing this early and having this documentation available, because we will guarantee then the involvement of the 400 plus residential units. This is really important, and we're very thankful for that. Now,
It's great. We welcome that. Thank you.
and what the issue I want to raise is called shock. And I know we're all in a state of shock from last week, and to a certain degree, but the shocks that I'm concerned about are, one, the federal budget expenditures, say, for instance, Department of Housing, which we can foresee some transmission of those shocks down to Maple Avenue and other places in our city, but also the promised diminution of the federal workforce. And so many of the people in our community actually work for the federal government. What impact will that have on the ability to generate revenues and to what can and will be done to stop people departing our neighborhood, both as renters but also as homeowners? So I know we recognize how difficult it is to anticipate this. Nonetheless, that said, we really need to be in the shock prevention mode. Thank you.
So that's a very good comment. Thank you. And, you know, we all hope and pray that the impact to our residents of what's to come is as small as possible, of course. You know, obviously we're going to need to be mindful of that, for sure. You make a very good point. We could have a lot of folks could be in a position where, say if they lost their jobs and they lose their homes, and it just could be devastating. And that's all the more reason that, I'm glad I'm in a community that pulls together like this and thinking and talking about this kind of stuff very early on. We don't have all the answers, but we will be happy to have the conversation with the community and listen to what your ideas are. Yes, Jessica.
Hi, thank you. First off, thank you so much for having this meeting, and I want to also thank you for starting the budget process much earlier. I do think it's going to make it possible for everybody to understand it better.
The mayor and council were very much in favor of doing that.
Thanks to them as well. I wondered if you could comment, Susan, you mentioned the bond for the library, and as I recall, that was intended initially to cover the cost of the library construction. And from what I can remember now, so far the expenditures for that are 15 million and counting. If I'm wrong, please correct me. But I was wondering if you could comment on the impact on our budget of that higher price tag than we originally had with the bond, and how that's going to be addressed or how you anticipate trying to address it in the coming year budget. Thank you.
Well, it's been addressed, that cost, and I don't have a lot of history here, but my understanding, and please correct me, Susan, if I'm wrong, but the cost has grown over the years, multiple years, for a variety of reasons. And most recently, because we've had some delays in this past year with permitting at the county level and some troubles with the utility companies, PEPCO, WSSC, and so on, that have added costs. That's true. The mayor and council, however, have kept this project on pace. It is at about $15.5 million approximately. And, you know, we are still looking at a June opening next year. So in terms of funds, we believe we have adequate funds in place. The one question has been what level of contingency, because there's still things, change orders, unforeseen things, you know, since they're still excavating certain utility lines and this and that. Is it possible there's some additional unanticipated costs? Yes, that's what a contingency fund is for. How much do we have in that contingency fund? Well, it's slim, and it's quite possible we might want to increase that a bit. But for the base budget of the library, we feel we have adequate funds in place to complete the project. And hopefully with the contingency that we have, that's adequate. We may, in all honesty, be asking for a little bit more in that contingency. That might take it up to closer to 16 million all told. But that's about where we are, I think. And again, please, if I've misspoken, let me know.
Sources.
Yeah.
To date, no funds have been drawn. So the sources include grants from a number of sources, ARPA funds, the contingency that Rob spoke of, the additional contingency, about $1.1 million was added via ARPA. We expect and hope that we do have other sources other than the general fund. So that's the goal. It has been the goal. It's high priority for us, and we will continue to do so.
Thank you very much, Mr. Eubanks. I was flailing my hands ridiculously to make sure that that point was very clear, that the additional funds for the library did not come from our general fund, but actually came from third-party sources. And one thing that I do want to stress is that the council has done a lot of work, and I've been talking to other municipalities. I know the question was raised earlier about the impact of the president-elect on our budget and what we may anticipate. One of the things that this council has been working diligently with our staff to do is to make sure that we're expending all of those federal dollars by the necessary deadlines to ensure that we can leverage all of those dollars as quickly as possible, because what we don't want to have happen is ARPA dollars that are left on the table because we have not expended those funds in enough time to ensure that they are not recouped by the Treasury. So there's been a lot of work that's been happening within our city staff to make sure that we're able to leverage third-party sources, as David mentioned, with the library grants, but we also hired a full-time grant writer who has also been actively pursuing third-party dollars to help us with funding the gap, as well as making sure that we're doing and taking creative steps in terms of leveraging those federal ARPA dollars to also cover certain aspects of our budget, given that we need to spend them relatively quickly and make sure that they're obligated within the federal deadlines.
One of those grants was also from the legislative delegation. We got a legislative bond initiative. So you can thank your state representatives for that, for bringing some state money into it. Yes.
So in previous,
It's on.
so in previous years, I think we've had some focus groups about the New Hampshire Avenue Rec Center and rebuilding that. And I wondered what the status is on considering a rebuild given our current capital expenditures. Thank you.
Presently, the mayor and council have allocated a small amount of funds for basically to look at plans and contingency for use of consultants in terms of determining, you know, if that site is ultimately what we can do there. We don't have capital money set aside. We don't have a bond issue pending. But we are looking very active. We understand the need. We understand that's an inadequate facility. The city inherited that a number of years ago from, not too many years ago, from the county. Not in the greatest shape. It's about 50 years old, and it's smaller than it should be, and it's not in the best shape, although city employees are keeping it as together as they can. But it is a much older facility. Staff, we are investigating a lot of different ideas about what we could do for a replacement facility. You know, at one point, and it was prior to my arrival, I believe the city had put out an RFP, request for proposals, to see if there was a developer that would be interested in taking it on, building, in essence, a rec center on the first level or two, and then housing above. And we did not get we did not get viable responses to that. So, but that doesn't mean we're going to quit trying, and doesn't mean that the mayor and council aren't still thinking about it. It still is a mayor and council priority to find a solution to that. Other questions, comments? Yes, sir. He's
Thanks.
going to get his 10,000 steps today.
So I'm Bob Dreher. I live in Ward 3 on Sycamore Avenue. You know, you're probably intended to get to this, and we didn't let you because we started asking questions. But you know, the budget process that we're facing for the coming year, I don't know enough about it, but my understanding is you're facing a real deficit that you need to cover in some way. And I'm looking at on page 7 the chart showing the real property taxes revenues obtained from residents of Tacoma Park mostly. I mean, it's also includes business. And, you know, it's gone up a lot. You know, over the space of the first like 7 years shown in this, it goes up by about $1.5 million. In the last 4 years, it's gone up by $3 million. That's money that we are paying, $3 million more today than we were paying like 4 years ago. And for many of us that have single family homes, I mean, there are all kinds of issues in this community about equity for renters, but for people with single family homes, you know, your assessment goes up. It doesn't mean you're actually wealthier until you sell your house. And so if people move out of Tacoma Park, then they can shed themselves of the tax liability they've been facing, and the new buyer buys the house and takes on the tax, knows what they're getting into. The rest of us just pay more every year. And so I just want to highlight the fact that, you know, you talked something here about constant revenue rate, but in fact, the city is taking $3 million more from us this year than it took 3 years ago.
Due to the valuations, yes.
Well,
The tax rate hasn't gone up.
right. I'm not saying anything about the assessment. That's where it's coming from. All I'm saying is the city is spending $3 million more that it gets from us than it did 3 years ago. And sooner or later, that has to end. And so you have to ask in the budget process, and I would ask you, do you intend to frame an alternative for the consideration that is a non-growth budget, that is a stable budget? And if so, how would you do that? I mean, and let me just...
The quick answer is yes, we are working on some ideas for that. But again, we don't have revenue projections, and I haven't even seen the expenditure proposals.
Gotcha.
Although my department heads, my senior leadership team has a very healthy understanding of the limitations that we're up against. I would say things we don't control is like inflation, and there's a lot of commodities, services, and expenses that we don't control for very, very basic services that we need to provide, and residents understandably expect and desire. The mayor and council have tried to do their part this past year by not raising the tax rate. I understand that it's still costing residents more each year because of the valuations, the assessments, and that is true. So your point's valid about the added expense. And earlier in the conversation, I had mentioned that I fully understood, and I think we all do on the city, that we have folks that, particularly, whether you're a senior citizen on fixed income or just anybody that's struggling to pay all the bills, including the tax bill, it makes it harder and harder to stay in your home. We don't like that situation either, and we are very sensitive to it. We're going to do what we can to try to not add to the tax burden. You know, we don't literally control assessments and valuation increases. You know, we're going to try and control costs. That's why I try to get the employees involved, looking for efficiencies right down to the front line. And, you know, there's not really a magic wand, but we're going to try on multiple levels to find ways to keep the cost of government as affordable as possible.
Well, I appreciate that. Let me just finish my suggestion, though, because probably many people in this room have had experience with budgeting processes, budgets as large as this or larger. And there are times in lean years where you need to direct your staff to prepare an alternative that does not grow. And then you ask your staff who are department heads and know what their department needs, what they would cut in order to achieve that budget. That didn't happen last year. And I'm not aware it has ever happened in the city that there has been a directive to the department heads to present an alternative budget that does not grow. And all I'm asking is, will you use that as a budgeting tool to evaluate? I'm not saying adopt it, just
I
evaluate.
understand. Yes, and that actually is part of our annual process. Now, I've been here for one budget, and I know for a fact that in some prior budgets, that also, department heads have offered cuts, and there were cuts. There were lower requests in a number of categories, and we've had services that we didn't offer in this current year that we did before. The city a couple of years ago did direct cash assistance to residents. We don't do that. We don't do that with this budget. And there's a number of things. The monies for a whole slew of programs were reduced in this current budget. There were some programs that were discontinued as well. We're going to have to double down and look at that very, very hard with this budget as well. Your point's well taken. And so the quick answer is yes, we're going to be having that conversation on the staff side. We understand that we want to bring in, a budget that is, obviously not going to cost any more than we have to. We may have to have these policy discussions. We will likely with the mayor and council when it comes to services, level of service, number of services, types of services, okay, and other means and methods to reduce the cost of government. That's all going to be on the table, and I think that's all going to be very, very important part of the conversation this year. But thank you for your question and your comment. It's well made. Yes, sir.
Paul Huebner, Ward 3. So what I'm hopeful to see, I have two comments. One is, when we do our home budget, we start from revenue. I have X number of dollars. I'm going to make $24,000 this year. Social Security and my pension, okay? $24,000, okay? Then I figure out what I can spend it on. I would like to suggest, I don't know if you've considered, the city should take some metric, okay, and take the budget and develop it from the expected revenue. Every year, the city posts the budget and they see projected revenue, projected expenditures. They routinely exceed revenue by at least 10%. Last year, it was they expected 30 and they had expenditures of $32.8 million, $2.8 million in 1 year. So I'm suggesting that we take the revenue, we divide it up to each department according to last year's expenditures, and give it to the managers, give it to the directors. It is their job to manage and control the means of production. That's what we did in every contract we negotiated. That is their job as the director. They can't do it, maybe they're not the right person. Ask them to return to the council exactly what the council and the residents will get for that dollar amount on a percentage basis to each department, and what they would have to, what they can perform, and what they would need to not do, to delete from their budget, from what they want, from their wish list. And the second thing I'd like to do is, I hope, now that the mayor's here, that we can have some kind of a resident budget. I'm serious. I'll work at it. And you'll see the numbers. It'll be real. If it ain't real, then just tell me. I'll hit the bricks.
Thank you, Paul.
I'm gonna leave now, but what I wanted to say is, Rob, you're new here, so you have a lot of credibility. And the people that were here were saying the same things, talking about the tax rate, which is misleading, saying that the tax rate didn't go up, which is misleading. It went up, as Bob said. We've seen people in our neighborhood driven out. And you keep talking about inflation. You know for a fact that it's legal and it's possible to say, we're not going to raise one dime more of revenue. We're not going to have one dime more of costs next year. And you all have to go back and figure out where you're going to cut, because we know there's inflation, because there's people being driven out. So there's a lot of words. It's been 90 minutes. Everybody here knows, and I know you're very effective because you don't run the city, so I get that. But it is legal for somebody to look at and say, we're not going to collect one dime more from these people because the The rate that we've collected has gone up more than the inflation rate 8 out of 10 years. And we've seen people driven out of our house because they're on fixed income. So there's 90 minutes of words, and you all know you could simply just say, here's the bucket of money. It's the same as we had last year. Now everyone go figure out where you're going to cut, because we got a ridiculous inflation rate at the national level.
Yeah. 80% of our expenses in most departments is personnel. Service, it's services, the employees that we have, and we don't have a lot of bench depth. We're a smaller organization. You're the county, and you've got to find a percentage to cut, or you do a constant yield rate. There's still probably tons of employees left. We don't really have that. Smaller cities don't. So frankly, while we do what we can do, it's going to take a lot to go to the point where you're doing a constant yield rate type budget. You're going to be losing people. That means you're losing services. Which services do you want to lose? That's really what it comes down to there, because we don't. That personnel is personnel. Okay, reducing services. Okay, well, that is ultimately a policy conversation. Services, and I think that will to some degree be on the table. What, and certainly y'all can bring it. What type of in order to achieve that financial goal, what services you're willing to trade off. Because you're only going to save so much in a lot of the operational stuff, because a lot of it is already lean. And I'm saying that as someone who's come in without up to this point, fresh eyes, and I'm not seeing that there's a lot of fat in the departments. I'm not. And I'm seeing employees who are talented and got some great managers, some of the best that I've ever worked with in my career. I'm not just saying it's true, but you start to say, if we're going to be at a constant yield approach, you're going to be looking at some drastic reductions in monies available to provide the services. And that is going to equate to people. It's going to equate to services. And that would be the position that we would be in. Again, it's a fair conversation to have. And that will be And in this longer budget development process, where you'll have a lot of additional opportunities to weigh in, let us know what type of services you'd be willing to do that, if that's how you feel about it. Because in order to achieve that kind of financial, because that's what it's going to take. There isn't really just a question of will here. It really is a question of dollars spent. But spent for what? Services. People and services are, in essence, the same thing, particularly for a smaller local government. Yes, sir.
Thank you so much. That actually is a really good segue. Emmanuel Wagner, Ward 2. I want to emphasize that the people that you hear from here are not necessarily the people that make up the city. So a lot of the residents I talk to that have young families that have just moved here, they look to the services that the city provides, and they don't, I think, want to have their services cut because they move here for what this city offers. I think the point about the expenses growing every year is a good one, and maybe there is a comparison to other municipalities in the county and the state to compare how their revenues and expenses are increasing. Just to put that in perspective, because we're a very small city and our staff that's very dedicated and very good, and I work with some of them, has the opportunity to go to other more attractive cities. And that means that we then have maybe less qualified or no staff to do those services that we actually want to have. So when we're talking about constant yield and all of that, keep that also in mind. This is an attractive city, and it attracts a lot of young families because of those reasons. So just because you hear this kind of like conversation here from our audience, that is not what I hear from my neighbors. So as you do this budgeting and you get public input, look out for those voices too.
All of this is really good. You, so your civic servant, it's good to hear this range of opinions. Thank you.
I feel a little bit like that person stole my thunder. I wanted to also point out that this is a barely, I don't even know what percent is here tonight, but it's not the majority for certain of Tacoma Park. And I wanted to make, kind of want to make the joke, maybe we can get Elon Musk to come in here and balance our budget for us or tell us where to cut. That's how I'm starting to feel about our city as of late. Also, I keep hearing a lot of fear talk. I have not, I don't know everyone in Tacoma Park. I see the real estate, and we all see it. There are houses, if people are leaving Tacoma Park because they can't afford to live here, I don't know one. I think that is fear talk. I think we would see real estate, a lot of people selling homes, and people are not leaving Tacoma Park. People want to come to Tacoma Park. This is a wonderful place to live. I love the services. Thank you. I don't like paying taxes any more than anyone else does, except that I kind of do because I want to pay for the services. I think the city gets it right. I am on fixed income. I am retired. My husband just recently retired. And it is a pleasure to pay taxes to a city like Tacoma Park to get the outstanding services that we have, to have a great place to raise our kids, to grow old in. And I thank you. And please, don't be discouraged. I know this is your first year, and all those voices that aren't here tonight, I hope they're in your head. Please stay with us, and I think that you will make it better for us, and I appreciate that. And I'm sure, I know a lot of other people do as well.
What encourages me about tonight is that folks are willing to come out and share their thoughts and be engaged and be that kind of community. Doesn't mean we're always going to agree. Doesn't mean we're always going to find the solutions together immediately. But what I like is the feel of this community, the feel even in this meeting, that we all care enough about this community, care about Tacoma Park enough that we want to express our opinions and our thoughts and our best ideas. And we don't have all the, I'll be the first to say, okay? Even though as talented as my staff is, and the mayor and council, and as talented and sincere as they are, and next council, none of us are going to pretend that we have all the answers. We're going to do our best, and we're going to continue to work with you, and we're not hesitant to ask for your opinions, and I think that we can benefit from hearing from you.
I know we're Saul Schneiderman, lived here since 1988, with 3. I'm glad to hear some stories about the wonderful staff that we have here. I know we're ending up the meeting. I could tell lots of stories, but I just want to say about 8 years ago, I was in my kitchen and I pushed the wrong button because I have a PhD, push your dummy, okay? I pushed the wrong thing on my phone and I called our police department. As soon as I heard it, I hung up. And about, seriously, 8 minutes later, there was a knock on my door. I answered the door, and there was a Tacoma Park police officer standing there. I said, "What are you doing here?" And he said, "We've had instances where battered spouses call us and hang up, right? And we thought something was wrong, and so we traced it, and we came and investigated it." Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I just want to point out, there are people talking about being driven out of Tacoma Park. And I know 2 other families and myself, my husband and I have these conversations all the time. We're like, especially when we see something like, I remember a few years ago, the whole pesticide banning thing, that was very duplicitous of county efforts. And I think a complete waste of our taxpayer money. So that's an example right there. It doesn't mean that we don't appreciate Tacoma Park. I do. We're living here now. We haven't left yet, even though we grit our teeth sometimes. But anyway, I just want to say there are other viewpoints out there, and I hear them from people, in addition to my husband.
Thanks, Rob. The breakdown of the different parts of the budget was really helpful, I think. And I hope that more and more people are able to hear that from many of us who've been here tonight to explain to others. I'm always dreaming of like a, happy, harmonious outcome. So I was wondering if you could share a few thoughts on some of those cost areas that do not have to do with personnel. And that would be street resurfacing, and some expenses with sidewalks. It would be consultant fees, and it would be the vehicle replacements. With consultant fees, I guess that's a separate category. But the other two, it seems like there's a schedule that's set up at some point in the past, and it's arguable that maybe streets don't need to be resurfaced as often anymore because of warmer temperatures. And it's arguable that vehicles last longer than they used to. I know that in our family they do. So I wondered whether when you're setting up those formulas, how often are those formulas themselves re-examined?
I may buy a used car from you. Mine don't have that kind of history. No, fair questions, and thank you. Any city, ultimately, when it comes down to what you're going to spend money on, we also have, yes, I talked about services, but I should have also mentioned our obligation to maintain infrastructure. Okay, we've got to have safe streets. We want to have ADA accessible crossings and safe pedestrian crossings. We want to be able to do the upkeep that, and not just to the streets. It's a stormwater system, other things that we're responsible for. And we have a certain amount of obligation. When it comes to the budget, ultimately, yes, cities literally can do less of these things. It's technically possible. The city probably has, if you look at our history of spending on streets, it has been lower than what has been recommended based on a broad range of criteria, okay, not just age, also condition and other things. And sometimes, and I'll say this generically, I've seen this in other cities, you could save money in the short term, long term, you end up not only having to catch up, to catching up at a higher rate of expense because the cost of asphalt and labor and everything else is going to be more expensive later on. So it's been a best practice, pretty much natural. Cities, counties, states, to the best of their ability, try to have a prudent repair schedule and replacement schedule. Or whether you're talking about infrastructure or you're talking about vehicles, because it can really catch up with you. You end up with a big bubble at the end where, oh my God, everything's failing all at once. Where are we going to find the money for that? Try to just keep chipping away at it prudently each year to a reasonable extent and to the extent that your budget can handle. There have been years, I know Daryl Braithwaite, our Public Works Director, who's here with us tonight, can attest that we've had years, particularly I'm sure during the pandemic, where we didn't have nearly as much money to keep up with our infrastructure and our vehicles as we would have professionally recommended and as need arose because we literally didn't have the funds. So we try in normal times to try and keep on the schedule. Most cities and counties try to do that. Can you be more efficient in those areas? My staff is constant to be efficient. We bid, and we try to be aggressive in getting the most value for the least cost that we can in a full array of things. But it's something to be mindful of. If push comes to shove, yes, you can do less spending on infrastructure. Okay. The thing with vehicles, And I'll use whether it's public works or police as an example. We don't want to put employees into unsafe situations. We've had vehicles that are literally falling apart. And we've had to, sometimes, even though we've got them funded, can't get them through the pipeline. Computer chips, delays, even the last hurricane slowed up the delivery of vehicles. I've gone on ride-alongs with our staff, code enforcement, public works, police, and I've been in vehicles that have been deadlined for some time. Yeah, these are vehicles that, and our ratings isn't just based on chronological years by any means. It's condition, it's repair history with the cost associated with it and other criteria that we have. We're going to not be able to recruit employees. We're going to have employees get hurt, which is the most important thing that we want to avoid. Okay, so we try to be conscious of these things as we look at it, but we also understand, hey, it's not Christmas morning every year. We're just not going to get every vehicle without justification. These have to be justified on multiple levels. First of all, by the department itself, and Daryl, and she's tough. She scrutinizes this stuff, okay? Then it's got to go through the city manager's office and me, and then it's the mayor and council, your elected representatives. And trust me, we get lots and lots of very good questions. And yourselves, residents, we get great questions from residents as well. Multiple levels of scrutiny with respect to what we're spending on vehicle replacement. We don't even have enough in our equipment replacement reserve to fund every vehicle that is scheduled in the coming years to be replaced. We're trying to operate year to year on those where we have the highest priority. And some of these are incredibly expensive, a garbage truck, a refuse, recycling vehicle, $500,000 and up. Thank God we don't have a fire department. I've had those and spent $1 million on one piece of apparatus. So these can be very, very expensive. Can you defer those things? Yes, but if it's at the cost of safety and ultimately service, that is something you have to weigh. And ultimately, sometimes it's a professional judgment as to, the budget versus what harm are we putting the employees and even the public in harm's way if vehicles are not going to operate the way they should, or the infrastructure is going to deteriorate to a level that people are going to get hurt. It's not a science, but it is a lot of professional judgment involved and a lot of eyes and minds on the issue. But thank you for raising that. It's a very good question. Yes, Jessica.
Hi, Jessica, Ward 1. I wanted to I'm going to squeeze in 2 questions. I know that's cheating. But with respect to the police vehicles, I know you mentioned that in your previous job in Rockville, that Rockville leases at least some of its police vehicles and that there was potential for cost savings there. So I was wondering if that's something that you are exploring. And then my other main question is, I realized, I read about it and heard about it, that the city has let a contractor who was working on it to develop management and performance metrics. And I was wondering if you could reflect on how that might relate to budget planning, et cetera. How are you going to use what are the data that you're looking to gather, and how will you use it in the process of budgeting in future years, assuming that I'm right about what the contract is about? Thanks.
I'll answer the first question, and I'll ask my deputy David to answer the second question, since he's working very directly on the performance metrics. With respect to leasing versus purchasing, yes, when I was in Rockville, we ultimately did do a transition. It took about a year to go from purchase to a lease arrangement. It wasn't for all city vehicles, but it was for a lot of them, and it did include the police cruisers. It wasn't necessarily cost savings as it was an interest in keeping a younger fleet, because with a lease arrangement, you can rotate them out maybe after 5 or 7 years, as opposed to hanging on to something for 10 or plus. And you don't end up with the maintenance issues and the maintenance costs, but you do have a rotation that occurs, and you have to spend, the flip side is you have to spend more money retrofitting, say, police cars all the aftermarket add-on stuff that goes on, all of the, whether it's the radios, you know, Chief, you can help me with some of the extras that go, the sirens, the radios, the cage, multiple other aftermarket features that all patrol cruisers must have. If you're doing that on a more regular basis, that can somewhat outweigh, the any potential cost savings. Ultimately, we wouldn't know until we really studied it. And frankly, this is going to, in Rockville, we needed, got a consultant, and we did a major internal study across multiple departments, Public Works, Police, other departments that had vehicles. And we ultimately came to the determination, in our case, at that time, 5 some years ago, that leasing from Enterprise was going to be the best option. But again, it wasn't solely for cost. A lot of it had to do with keeping a fresher fleet. This is something we're willing to look at, and it is difficult, I'll be honest with you, to do it just with internal folks. There are professionals that specialize in looking at the pros and looking at our situation and what's on the market, what's available, and frankly doing that analysis. You've got to do an analysis because of the amount of dollars that are involved, and you're typically signing on to a 5-year commitment, so it's a big deal. David, could you address please the performance metrics?
Sure. So we, Ms. Lammy, you're absolutely correct. There's a current RFP, which we've just recently closed, and are in the process of selecting a vendor. So just today, we actually started the interview process, and we expect to have that process concluded in the next 2 weeks or so. The intent of the RFP, I guess if I had to synthesize the description, is twofold. One is to design a program that encourages additional transparency with the public about our service delivery, which is the second component of or goal of the operation, which is to allow for the collection of data that gives us some feedback about how well programs and departments are performing, how well we're attempting to achieve the goals that have been outlined by council and by the city manager's office. So this particular RFP is not about the implementation of such a program, it's the design of it. So we have an existing program that basically collects a significant amount of outputs, and it's included, the information is included in our budget. We want to expand that so that it's not just about collecting the outputs, but expanding the program such that it allows us to, again, evaluate what we do and make certain decisions based on the information that's received. We talked a little bit about how do we create efficiencies and how do we kind of better align the mission and the performance, and this is intended to allow us to do that. In terms of what it does to the budget, we expect that the design is going to inform the program moving forward. So there's likely to be a number of years in which we have to build the program. What that means, I don't know. That's what we've hired the consultant for. Could there be a performance management system? Potentially. Could there be a performance management operation in the city manager's office? Potentially. But we're hoping to be aided by the vendor to give us this sense of what it is we need to create this more robust program to allow that type of evaluation.
A comment first, followed by a very brief question. I was concerned about an earlier comment from a gentleman suggesting that this audience here does not represent all of Tacoma Park. Of course not. The implication in his comment was also there are just a lot of old white hairs, old folks in here, and the voices of the young people are not being heard. I think this kind of ageist comment is really quite dangerous. And I'd like to point out that the board of Long Branch, all of the board members are much younger than I am. And the great majority of people in Long Branch, the 400 and some residential units, are occupied by people much younger than me. And in fact, he ought to be quite grateful that I am here because I am retired and I have the time and the ability to go around and work closely with all those families who are caught up in the rat-a-tat of daily life and taking care of kids. So I want to be really careful about misrepresentation of who is here and who is not here. My question then is, quite simply, has SDAT communicated the percentage increase in the assessed value of properties here in Tacoma Park?
Usually the assessable value as well as the constant use tax rate is sent from SDAT in the middle of February. But this year, since we're moving our budget process a little bit early, so for us to estimate the property tax, we have to do our past history of how the assessable rate was determined. So this would be another estimate that we have to do in order to find out what is the accessible rate increase in the next fiscal year. So this is a little bit different from the prior years, because prior years we have the constant use tax rate, we have the accessible rate, everything is present in front of us, and then we determine our revenue. But this year is all based on past history. It could change, and then so we were thinking about if the accessible value was dramatically different from what we estimated, we should do adjustment during our budget reconciliation.
We would eventually have that information. Certainly well before the mayor and council would need to make a decision. Of course, yes.
Rob, I do, this is Bob Ferrer again, I do want to thank you very much for having this as the start of a dialogue with the community. You have heard of a wide range of views, and that's, I think, very healthy. I do think, I mean, I just have to say, I'm not an accountant or a budget expert on this. There's a lot of information in the handout you gave out that is hard to understand, and it doesn't really frame the questions that the city faces and that the city's residents face very clearly. One of the things that would help, I think, side by side with the growth in the residential tax revenues, which is shown on page 7, would be the growth in city staff. And the city budget has grown over that time. And so when you say that if we were to hold the line at a no increase budget, we'd be talking about losing people and services. I guess what the question is, why do we need to add staff every year? Well, so
This current
that,
year's
show
budget,
that.
we did not add any. We did not add any FTEs, and it's not my intention.
That's very helpful. See, that's the kind of thing that will really help reassure people that, I mean, there is a sense that things are a little bit out of control because we hear about a deficit and that kind of thing. So it's
But
very
I will
reassuring to have you say something concrete like that. Thank you.
Yeah, I will say this, from my experience, and my experience here is limited. My experience in my 28 years as a city manager in Maryland, Florida, Ohio. Generally when FTEs increase, it as a result of a call for additional or expansion of services. That's ultimately the policy decision. Because when communities, and it's not just mayors and councils, I'm used to seeing over the entire span of my career, residents, delegation, organizations, civic organizations, delegations from the community say, we'd like to have more of this, more of that, expanding recreation programs, expanding senior programs, more policing. When I was in Rockville, the big issue was we don't have nearly enough police officers. Okay? We added probably 10 in the span of the first 3 years that I was there. Okay, but it's all relative to what your situation is. The feeling in that case of public safety, there've been a jump in incidents. And the mayor and council were, I think, right to try to respond by increasing the level of service in response to calls for it by the public. So, and sometimes it's not as dramatic as that, but it could be expansion of recreation programs. Hey, we got waiting lists. We can never get into these programs. Why don't we have more classes? Well, that takes people. I'm talking about other places. Here, this past year, all I can speak to is that we did not add FTEs last year, and it's not my intention to add FTEs for the coming year. We'll try and be mindful of it. We understand. But again, people professional staff equate to services. Services usually that have been requested or strongly desired by the community. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Just one more earlier comment that I made earlier. Maybe take a look at some of the recommendations that came out of various committees over the last few years. There was not too long ago a parking task force that created a set of recommendations to look at revenue generating. Not only it wasn't dedicated to that, but it included revenue generating opportunities from, let's say, parking across the city. One example is we're charging far less for parking spots at the DC border than DC does. So a lot of cars park, in Maryland, in our city. So stuff like that could also be, it's small peanuts, probably, but we haven't adjusted some of those costs in quite a while. I think the residential parking permits haven't seen an increase in over 6 or 7 years. If we're talking about adjusting to inflation, those could also be included. So there are probably some areas where additional revenue could be generated, and their recommendation. And I think Council Member Schlegel elect can adhere to that. He was on that committee as well.
That's a good point, and I think that doing a review of fees within the purview, each department has that opportunity to recommend whether they think that we're covering costs or there's an opportunity. It's years. One example is, we haven't increased the stormwater fee in years, and yet there's been a lot of interest in expanding programs, and expanding maintenance. Should there be one of the questions will be, shall we, provide the revenue? That's an enterprise fund, money in, money out. If there isn't enough money in, we can only spend what does come in. Maybe, if there's a community-wide desire to have more in the way of stormwater services, that might have to be considered. We also need to be sensitive to questions about affordability for folks from the standpoint of, say, as an example, recreation programs. Do we want to, sure, we could charge more for recreation programs. Do we want families to be costed out of access to programs? I think we have to be careful about that. We do have scholarships. That's the reason we have scholarships. But sometimes that's not enough. Having exceedingly high fees just because we could, or because we want to match maybe what the county's charging, some of their facilities, might have a real dampening effect in the first place on families that would otherwise wish to have their children involved in a program, or a senior on a fixed income. So we have to be sensitive about economic access to some of the services that we provide. And I know this mayor council is sensitive to that. This is something that's all part of the conversation. Yes, ma'am.
Appreciate your thoughts on that. I think one of the issues that we come across as a city periodically is the idea that we are duplicating services that the county provides, and we know that the rebate from the county is not covering the cost that the city incurs for providing those services. And I think it would be a really good idea to engage the community in thinking through what services do we really want to control as a city, and what can we potentially give back to the county. For example, things like stormwater management that actually require a lot of pretty significant engineering expertise and might be thought of in a bigger geographic area than just here in the city, might be something that actually we don't want to manage as a city anymore. And maybe we can think about ways to approach the county to kind of divest ourselves of some of those responsibilities. And I do want you to know, I realize you weren't here, but we restructured the stormwater fund. And so for those of us in Ward 1, our stormwater fees increased at least 40, and I think my own doubled over basically 2 years.
Not in the last 3. I don't think we've had an increase. Have we? Sorry? 2022 is the last time there was an increase.
Right, but it was pretty significant change for many of us in an increased.
Sure.
So I just wanted to make
Understood.
sure you.
Understand. Yep. Okay. Any other questions or?
I just want to say thank you all so much for coming out tonight. I know that there's been a lot of work that this council has done. I've equated our budget to kind of bringing things down to bringing a plane in for a landing, where we're trying to balance the winds in different directions and still trying to make it such that we're able to ramp things down in a way that is not disruptive, but also is productive, and really want to make sure that folks understand that we've been doing a lot, at least to try to address the short-term budgetary needs. I will say our new city manager presented for the first time since I've been on council a budget that did not ask the council to cut the budget to make sure we don't have a tax increase. The process for the budget was always we would get a city manager budget that's presented to us with a tax increase. The council will then have to try to figure out how to bring it down for a landing. But this time around, what the council has done in terms of flipping the schedule on its head is it allows for the council to give far more upfront direction to the city manager and to our staff around what we are interested in seeing in terms of a budget that's presented to us. And this particular council said one of our goals is to have a budget that does not include a tax increase. So when you present a budget to us, let's make sure that it is balanced and it does not include a tax increase. We also clearly communicated what our budget priorities were. Specifically, what are the things that we want to make sure that the budget that is presented to us addresses to some capacity, recognizing that we can't do everything, but at least our attempt is to provide more guidance to our staff. And then also, I do want to just, again, send a special shout out to Deputy City Manager Eubanks and all of our staff that worked on our union negotiations so that we have multi-year union contracts in place, which allows us to better forecast the cost of labor going forward. I know that there's a lot of folks that are really wanting us to kind of get down to that constant yield, but we also have to keep in mind that given our staff, it's not always the case that the cost of staff or the ECI and the cost of inflation necessarily align, especially if you're looking at things like healthcare costs and things like that. So I really, really, really appreciate all of you coming out. I want to encourage you all to please, please, please encourage your neighbors. Our staff have sent out a survey through the newsletter to let us know what it is that you want to your priorities are and what you value. I want to encourage everyone to please submit that survey because it's going to be really helpful for the future council to know kind of where your priorities are and where some of those trade-offs in terms of services that people would be open to us considering. So again, I just want to thank everybody for coming out and really want to encourage people to complete that survey because it's going to provide the new council some really valuable information about where the community is in terms of your priorities, in terms of the services that we provide.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. And that survey is also online on the city's website. So you can find it, and if you have difficulty with any of it or access, please reach out. Let us know. But I really, really appreciate everybody coming tonight. You know, all of your voices have been important, and this is just the beginning of a long process, but it's also the beginning of a conversation, I hope, where we can continue to try and share information, understand each other, and understand, you know, we as staff better understand what you all are thinking and what your thoughts and desires are, what your concerns are, and what your questions are, and we'll do our best. So we'll do our best.
I was a young parent with kids here in Tacoma Park 40 years ago, and I know how hard it is to get out. It's not going to stop me from coming and talking now, sorry. But we need to find ways to engage folks with their kids. I don't know, have a pizza party or something and have daycare and bring them in here. Let's have it over at the other rec center. I mean, we need to be creative to find all the voices. We're not here just to get our voices met. We're here to take care of our city. And that's all of us. And that's why the way we need to think about this. And we're coming into some terrible times, folks. I don't know if anybody's thinking about it, but we really have some real challenges coming up. The whole idea of immigration and what it means to be a sanctuary city. What does that leave us? We have to be a community that stands together. So,
Thank you for your comments. Thank you again for coming, and safe travels home.
Didn't really, I mean, this, I just said on a positive note, we had dialogue.